A quiet shift is underway in American politics, and it isn't being driven by elections, protests, or dramatic speeches. It's happening in courtrooms, regulatory hearings, budget offices, and local council chambers. At the center of this shift sits Gavin Newsom, governing the most powerful blue state in the country, a moment when executive authority is running into limits that rarely make headlines. What looks like routine friction is actually something deeper, a recalibration of how much power governors can realistically exercise, even in states where their party dominates. Within the first few seconds of this story, here's the reality most people miss. Blue states are not immune to constraints. In fact, they may be encountering them faster. California's governor holds enormous formal authority, backed by a legislature controlled by his own party and a voter base broadly aligned with his priorities. And yet, policy after policy is encountering resistance not from political opponents, but from institutions designed to slow power down. That tension matters nationally, because it reshapes what leadership looks like in an era of high ambition and low tolerance for error. If you've followed politics long enough, you know that real power isn't measured by how many bills are signed. It's measured by how much of an agenda survives implementation. That's where the story around executive power begins to change. California has passed aggressive laws on housing, climate, labor standards, healthcare, and regulation. On paper, the authority is sweeping. In practice, execution is being negotiated, delayed, revised, or narrowed often through mechanisms that rarely capture public attention. One of the clearest signs of this shift is the growing role of courts. Judicial review of state authority has become more active, not because judges are suddenly ideological, but because expansive policy inevitably tests statutory boundaries. Regulatory deadlines get challenged, enforcement authority gets scrutinized, implementation timelines get paused. None of this looks dramatic in isolation, but together it produces something new, a governor whose power is continually mediated rather than decisively exercised. Here's the part most casual coverage skips. These aren't defeats in the traditional sense, they're friction points. They represent the legal system doing exactly what it was designed to do: interpret, constrain, and clarify authority. But when that happens repeatedly, it changes how leadership is perceived. The governor still speaks confidently. The laws still exist, yet the actual pace of change slows, and that slowdown becomes politically meaningful. If you're someone who tends to follow institutional dynamics rather than personalities, this is usually the moment you lean in. Because people who pay attention at this level know that when execution becomes the story, power is already being renegotiated. And viewers who appreciate that kind of analysis usually don't need to be told why it matters, they already know. Housing policy offers one of the most revealing examples. California has enacted some of the most aggressive housing reforms in the country, aiming to override local zoning resistance and accelerate construction. The governor has framed housing as a statewide crisis requiring statewide authority. Legislatively, that authority exists, but on the ground, implementation runs through cities, counties, planning boards, and courts. Each layer introduces delay, reinterpretation, or pushback, often through lawful means. Ask yourself this question: if a governor can pass laws but cannot ensure timely execution without prolonged negotiation, how much power does that office truly hold? That question doesn't accuse anyone of failure. It forces a distinction between formal authority and functional control, and that distinction is becoming harder to ignore in blue states where ambition is highest. Budget constraints at another quiet limit. California's fiscal structure depends heavily on volatile revenue sources, capital gains, and high-income earners. During strong economic cycles, that volatility looks like abundance. During slower cycles, it looks like constraint. Programs launched during surplus years suddenly face sustainability questions, forcing governors to make trade-offs that narrow their freedom of action. Budget math, more than ideology, sets boundaries that no executive order can override. There's an irony here worth pausing on. Blue states often pride themselves on strong institutions, rule of law, and checks on power. Those same strengths now shape the limits governors face. The more complex and accountable the system, the harder it is for any single executive to move quickly. That's not a flaw, but it is a reality that complicates narratives of decisive leadership. Midway through this story, It's worth noting something about audience behavior. People who stay engaged with this kind of discussion usually aren't looking for heroes or villains, they're looking for clarity. They want to understand why outcomes don't always match intent. And that's typically where informed viewers decide they're in the right place, because shallow explanations stopped working a long time ago. Let's introduce a pattern interrupt that reframes the issue. What if the quiet limits of executive power are not a weakness, but a stress test? Blue states like California are attempting large-scale transformation within highly institutionalized systems. That combination exposes every seam. Smaller states may avoid this scrutiny simply because their ambitions are smaller. Scale changes everything. Local governments are another source of constraint that rarely gets framed as such. City and county leaders are legally responsible for implementing many state policies, from housing to environmental standards. When they raise concerns about funding, staffing, or timelines, it isn't rebellion, it's capacity signaling. And when capacity becomes the bottleneck, executive power becomes conditional rather than absolute. Federal dynamics further complicate the picture. Many state initiatives rely on federal funding, waivers, or regulatory alignment. Shifts in federal rules, court interpretations, or enforcement priorities can quietly reshape what governors can do. In that sense, even powerful blue state executives operate inside a layered system where authority is shared, contested, and periodically redefined. Here's a question that invites disagreement, and it should. Are governors being judged unfairly for limits that are structural, not personal? Or should voters expect leaders to anticipate and manage these constraints more effectively? Reasonable people land on different sides of that question, and that's why it drives such durable debate. What's clear is that national audiences are paying closer attention. California is often treated as a policy preview for the rest of the country. When its governor encounters execution limits, it shapes how similar proposals are evaluated elsewhere. Supporters point to ambition and intent, skeptics point to friction and delay. Both interpretations gain traction because both contain truth. Another subtle shift is happening in media coverage. Stories increasingly focus not on what was announced, but on what actually happened months later. Did construction accelerate? Did emissions drop? Did costs stabilize? This outcome-oriented lens places pressure on executives in a way campaign cycles ever did. It's less forgiving, and it's more persistent. If you find yourself drawn to this kind of analysis, you're probably not someone who tunes in for breaking news adrenaline. You're someone who tracks patterns, and people who track patterns tend to subscribe to depth, not drama. That's usually where serious viewers decide to stick around, because surface-level politics no longer explains what they're seeing. Now comes the debate-driven moment. In your view, are these quiet limits a sign that blue state governance is maturing, or a sign that ambition has outrun institutional capacity? There's no single answer, but not weighing in almost feels like missing the real conversation. As Act 3 approaches, the payoff becomes clearer. This isn't a story about one governor losing power. It's about executive power being reshaped by systems that voters themselves have endorsed over decades: courts, local control, fiscal rules, and federalism. The governor remains influential, but influence now flows through negotiation rather than command. The consequences extend beyond California. Governors in other blue states are encountering similar dynamics as they push ambitious agendas. Courts are more active. Local governments are more vocal. Budgets are tighter. The model of unilateral executive action, popular in moments of crisis, is giving way to something slower and more constrained. Timing matters here. With national politics polarized and trust in institutions fragile, how executive power is exercised or limited will shape public confidence. If systems adapt smoothly, constraints look like stability. If they don't, constraints look like dysfunction. The difference often lies in management, not messaging. Ultimately, what's at stake isn't whether Gavin Newsom succeeds or fails personally. It's whether large, complex states can govern ambitiously without over-promising outcomes they can't deliver quickly. That question will influence elections, court battles, and policy design long after individual headlines fade. The quiet limits of executive power rarely announce themselves. They reveal themselves over time, through adjustments, delays, and recalibrations. And once those limits become visible, Leadership is judged less by intent and more by resilience. That shift is already underway. If you want to keep following how executive authority is being redefined in real time, there's another piece of this puzzle unfolding right now, one that connects directly to how budgets, courts, and political expectations intersect. That's where this story continues.